All righty. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I always enjoy coming around and talking about one of my favorite topics, which is ritual. And there you see some of the major sources I'm drawing from, a couple of books of mine, and I do encourage you to go out and buy as many of my books as you can. I still have, I still have kids in school, so I still need all the royalties. Plus, they make great doorstops and paperweights and all that kind of stuff. Okay, make sure I hit the right button here. Yeah, that's Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa. As they appeared in probably early 1972, teammates on the Old Christians Rugby Club in Montevideo, Uruguay. Okay, two very handsome, healthy, strapping-looking young men, and that's what they looked like after they spent 10 weeks stranded in the Andes Mountains. They were on their way with their rugby club from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile to play a rugby match. They never made it. The plane crashed in the Andes Mountains. They were stranded for over 2 months, they and their teammates. And they then, the two of them, had to make a 10-day trek across the Andes Mountains, up and over a 15,000-foot mountain peak. These aren't mountain climbers. These are two teenagers in tennis shoes. They had no equipment. They had no experience. Canessa had not even seen snow in his whole life before this. But they made it. Now, they are part of what has come to be known as the Miracle in the Andes event or incident, which maybe some of you are familiar with. And what's probably most famous about that is that in order to survive for over 2 months stranded on a mountain, they had to practice cannibalism. They had to use the dead bodies of their friends who died in the crash in order not to starve. But that's not really what I'm going to talk about here. What I really want to talk about with these guys is at the end of this 10-day trek that they made to find help, they encountered this man, Sergio Catalan. And it's the encounter between Canessa and Parado and Sergio Catalan that I think we see put on display what it is that makes us human, what it is that separates humans from every other species. And so I want to focus on that encounter where these two guys that have been trekking across the Andes Mountains, who have been stranded for over 10 weeks, starving to death, dying, and finally they come in contact with civilization, with somebody who can help them. And that's Sergio Catalan, and how that encounter took place. Well, the encounter took place here. This is the Rio Azufre, which is in the foothills of the Chilean side of the Andes Mountains. However, you have to envision it much bigger, more swollen. The current is much faster, much louder because of the snow of the runoff. This was taken during the summer, so you don't have the runoff anymore. So on one side, we have Parado and Canessa, who have been trekking across the Andes Mountains. They are exhausted. Canessa, in fact, has collapsed. We think he was probably suffering from dysentery by this point, and he's about at the end of his rope. And so he is just sitting up against a tree. Parado is in a little better shape physically. He's roaming around looking for combustibles, sticks, whatever, because it's late afternoon, 5:30. It's going to get cold. The sun is going down. Shadows are getting long. They're going to try to build a fire to stay warm. Okay. Also, you should know that even though Roberto Canessa is just about immobile, he has very good eyesight. Parado, on the other hand, is physically a little stronger. He's still more mobile. He has terrible eyesight. He is terribly nearsighted, and he lost his glasses long ago in the crash. All right. Now, from across the river, this guy on horseback comes down, Sergio Catalan, to check some cattle. He's a rancher, and he has some cattle in the area. And Canessa is obviously going to be the first one to spot him. And he looks across the river, and he says the words to Parado that are the beginning of the end of this terrible ordeal for them. He says, "I see a man." And as soon as Parado hears that, he drops everything, and he starts running wildly toward the riverbank, waving his arms, screaming, yelling. But he can't see Catalan across the river. And so what happens next is almost slapstick comedy if the stakes hadn't been so desperately high. And that is Canessa now tries to more or less line him up with Catalan on the other side. And he says, to the left, to the left, to the left. No, too far, to the right, no, too far, go this way. And so you have this craziness going on. Finally, Parado gets more or less lined up, and he can more or less make out Catalan across. And he has to, well, think about this for a moment from Catalan's point of view. This is early 1970s South America. And here he is looking across at these wild-looking mountain men, waving and crying at him, bearded, emaciated. Who are these guys? Are they revolutionaries on the run from the army? Are they drug dealers? Are they bandits? We could forgive him for being a little bit wary of these guys. So somehow, Parado has to communicate with him, for the love of God, don't fear us. Save us, we're dying. And our friends are dying back at the crash site. Help us. And so what does he do? Oh, I'm sorry. I got it. He falls to his knees and he begs like this. And immediately, all of the differences of age and nationality and everything just fall away, and Catalan realizes these guys need my help. And he does give his help. He alerts the authorities, and I got to remember to point this way and not that way. And this is a picture of the remaining survivors back at the crash site as the rescue helicopters circled around. All right, so what do we see here in this encounter? I think we see two things that define humans. All right? Number one, our unparalleled cooperative ability, our ability to work together to achieve some important goals and ends. In this case, saving their lives. All right? Our ability to work with others, compensating for our weaknesses to accomplish some important task or goal. This really was the lame leading the blind, right? Okay, and you can't get any other species to do that. Okay. And not only are we seeing our unparalleled cooperative abilities on display here, but we're seeing the mechanism by which we have forged cooperation over the course of our evolutionary history, and that is using ritual. It was a ritualized gesture that Parado used to make the emotional connection with Catalan across the river. He fell to his knees and he begged. I think any human across the globe would understand the meaning of that gesture. Okay? And with that, a bond was created, and they were then able to save 16. There were 45 originally on the plane. Only 16 survived. Okay, so laying it out in a much clearer, more specific way, there we go. Here's what I'm going to try to convince you of. One, humanity is defined by cooperative communities. All right, so if we're trying to ask what is it that makes humans distinct, different from any other species on the globe, my answer and the answer of others who study this is that we are the ultra-social species. We're able to form communities that cooperate and work together with each other in ways that no other species can. If you take it then a step farther and you ask, okay, well, there is probably the most cooperative community that we have on the globe, and that is traditional hunter-gatherers. Okay. If you go a step farther, and you ask, well, what defines community? What creates these highly cooperative communities? Ritual. Okay? Ritually ensured trust. And not just any kind of ritual that exacts some kind of a cost on the individuals that are engaging in the ritual's acts. That's a costly ritual there. That's the Mandan Indian sun dance that they use to initiate new warriors into the tribe, where they embed skewers and hooks in their pectoral muscles, and they hang them from a ceremonial tent. Okay? I guess once you've done that with your comrade, you can trust him in battle. He's not going to run and cut and run when things get tough. Okay? So you can trust him. All right? So costly ritual, then, is the mechanism by which we ensure trust in these very cooperative communities. As a corollary to this, I'm going to argue, okay, how is it that you are going to motivate people to engage in costly rituals like the Mandan Indian sun dance? And not all rituals have to be quite that costly, but they have to exact some kind of a cost. And what our ancestors discovered was probably the best way, the most effective way that you can motivate people to engage in costly ritual behavior is supernatural belief. We're not just watching you. The ancestors are watching you. Every generation that's come before you is watching you. The gods are watching you. The spirits are watching you. Don't let us down. Okay? And that, I think, is why religion and supernatural belief for the course of our history have always been a human universal. You can't find a traditional society, or nearly any society, that doesn't have some kind of supernatural belief. Okay. And then finally, I'm going to argue that it was a ritual that sustained humanity against extinction. Okay. We would probably have gone extinct if we hadn't practiced costly rituals. And then it elevated humanity We practiced costly rituals other hominid species did not. And so when we started spreading out across the globe, the reason why we displaced them is because we were the ritual species and they weren't. Okay? And so the reason why we are here talking about this and Neanderthals aren't is because we practice rituals they didn't. Okay? All right, so let's jump into it. First part of my argument, okay? Humanity is defined by cooperative communities. One of the fellows that has been at the forefront of doing research, which has pushed our thinking in this direction, is this fellow, Michael Tomasello. And I'm going to talk more specifically about some of the research that he has done. He and a lot of the work of him and his colleagues have led them to believe that when we think about humans, we should refer to them as the ultrasocial species. That's what makes us different from any other species out there, our ability to work together with each other and cooperate with each other. If you would have asked maybe 30 years ago, what is it that makes humans different from any other species? The answer you would have gotten probably would have fallen along some kind of intellectual or cognitive lines. We're smarter than they are. We have language, they don't. We can think analogically, they can't. We can use symbols, they can't. Okay? Over the past 20, 30 years or so, a lot of the evidence saying that other species didn't have these capabilities has eroded away. Okay? We can demonstrate that other species can do a lot of these things. Okay? They can use language, they can think symbolically and reason analogically. Maybe not to the same extent, more limited extent, but we can't say these things are totally unique to humans anymore. Okay? But Tomasello and others, what they have argued is that what's really unique about humans is that we've taken these intellectual abilities and we've directed them toward our social intellect. Okay? We've taken them and we've used them in a specific way, and that is to understand other members of our species and work together with other members of our species in ways that no other species can. And Tomasello argues this happened in a two-step evolutionary process. Okay, so what happened over the course of our evolution that made us the ultra-social species is, first of all, we had to engage in obligate cooperative foraging. And there's some obligate cooperative foragers, again, traditional hunter-gatherers. In these traditional societies, they cooperate quite effectively. Both the women gathering things, men when they go out hunting, they work together in order to get the resources necessary to survive. Well, Tomasello argues at some point in our evolutionary history, to get the resources necessary to survive, food, shelter, we had to work with others. We couldn't do it by ourselves anymore. And those of our ancestors that couldn't figure out how to work effectively with others, they starved to death. Okay? And so they simply got selected out of the population. And so what obligate cooperative foraging does is it selects for a cooperative mind, a mind that wants to and is able to work with others effectively. Well, now what happens if you have cooperatively foraging groups and they start to bump into each other as they're jockeying over scarce resources? You get the second stage of the evolutionary process, group competition. Okay? And so that's stage two. Now these cooperatively foraging groups are going to start to compete with each other where there are scarce resources, and this is going to select for a tribal mind, not just a cooperative mind, a tribal mind. What's a tribal mind? What's the difference between a tribal mind and a cooperative mind? A cooperative mind is working together with others out of self-interest. Okay? I'm going to work together with you because I'm going to get something out of it. I'm going to get food. Okay? So we cooperate and we both get rewarded for it. Our self-interest is matched up and lined up with our cooperation. The tribal mind puts the tribe and the code of the tribe and the cooperative norms of the tribe above the self. It's a sacrificial mind. It's a mind that says, I will give myself, including my life if necessary, to the tribe. Group interests outweigh self-interests. All right? And so I like to think of this, it's a bit extreme, but it's the difference between hippies and Marines. Okay? Marines live by a code, Marines will die for each other. Hippies like to hang around with each other, but they ain't going to go that far. Okay? Hippies have cooperative minds. Marines have tribal minds. Okay? All right, so let's start diving into this even more. Look at some of the work that Mike Tomasello has done, looking at the cooperative differences between ourselves and our closest relatives, which are chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, other non-human primates. Okay, and he asked, well, what's the difference? Because one of the things we can see very clearly is that our closest primate relatives are very social, and they live in large social groups, and they cooperate with each other very often in these social groups. However, Tomasello and others, in their observations, they argue, yeah, but if you look carefully at their cooperative abilities, it's almost equally balanced out by the competitiveness that exists within the group. Competitiveness that comes out of their social hierarchy. Okay? And because of the social hierarchy, this places limits on cooperation. Why should I go out and forage with you if you're a more dominant member of our social group? And as soon as we come across some reward of some kind, some big cache of food, you'll just take it all because you're more dominant than I am. Right? And because of that, when we look at the foraging that chimpanzees and gorillas and bonobos and other non-human primates do, they largely do it solitarily. They do it by themselves. They are solitary foragers, not cooperative foragers. You can demonstrate this in a laboratory setting. This is one of Tomasello's studies here. He has 2 chimpanzees, or in other conditions, he'll have 2 children. They have to work together to bring in a reward. So in this case, we have 2 chimpanzees, side-by-side cages. They have a platform, and the platform is out of reach, but if they pull simultaneously on rods or on ropes, they can bring it within reach so that they can get the reward. Okay, so they have to cooperate to get a reward, kind of like cooperative foraging, all right? Well, if you have the reward in 2 separate piles like this, okay, then the 2 chimpanzees pull it in, they each grab their pile, munch, 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 everything's fine. Cooperation can continue. But in another condition, one of the things Tomasello will do is he'll put it instead of 2 separate piles, 1 big pile in the middle of the platform, right? They work together to bring it in within reach, and then what happens? The more dominant chimpanzee says, thank you very much. And cooperation ends. Okay? What if you do the same thing with children? All right? You have it in 1 big pile, they pull it in. Most of the time, the kids will split it up more or less equitably. And cooperation can continue. All right? Tomasello says this is what we learned during this stage of obligate cooperative foraging. And that is something he calls effort-reward justice. Those of our ancestors who successfully got through this obligate cooperative foraging stage, the reason why they got through it is because a certain kind of mentality was present in them. And that is, look, if both of us work together to achieve some kind of reward, we both then should get some part of it. Effort and reward have to go together. Chimpanzees never figured that out because they never went through the stage of obligate cooperative foraging. Those of our ancestors who couldn't figure this out starved to death. Okay, because nobody would work with them. And so this is the cooperative mind. The cooperative mind at least understands that there has to be some kind of connection between the effort put forth and the reward that is then gained. What happens when obligate cooperative foraging groups start to bump into each other and compete? The tribal mind starts to evolve. The mind that starts to put the group and the interests of the group above self-interest. All right? When we start to look at tribes that exist, right, like traditional hunter-gatherers, or tribes that still, groups that still behave in a rather tribal-like way, even in modern society, like Orthodox Jews, or motorcycle gangs, or Marines, one of the things we can notice about all of these tribes is they are ritually marked. Okay? They have some kind of badges on them displaying their group membership, right? That usually comes about because of ritual participation of some kind. So one of the things you need to make sure of if you're in a tribe is that the other guy in your tribe is just as committed to the code of the tribe as you are, so that when things get tough, they're not going to cut and run. Okay? They're not going to put self-interest over the interest of the group. And the way that we ensure that within the group, amongst the members of the group, is through ritual. And the way that we show then that this person has been through the rituals, and therefore we can trust them as a good, loyal tribe member, they show signs, okay, of their membership in the tribe. Right? And so this is community. Right? Community, these highly cooperative communities, these tribes that evolved over the course of our evolution, and all of us are descendants of tribal humans. Right? They used this as a way of ensuring the trust within the tribe so that they could work together and cooperate with each other. So how can we be sure another one puts the tribe before the self? Ritual displays. Okay? Rituals create tribes, and we all are descendants of tribes. Why ritual? Why did ritual become the way in which tribes formed these very tight-knit cooperative communities? The answer to that is because we didn't invent ritual. Okay? Ritual is much, much older than Homo sapiens. Ritual has deep evolutionary roots. Nature evolved ritualized behaviors amongst various species across the animal kingdom whenever it was essential that effective communication had to take place. Okay? And what were they communicating? Typically, they were communicating their intentions and their commitments. Right? And we can see examples of this across many species in the animal kingdom. Are you going to be a good committed mate? Do a mating dance with me. Okay? Are you committed to making it really tough for me to catch you if I'm a predator and you are prey? Do a stodding ritual. This is the stodding ritual display of Thompson's gazelles, and you may have seen it on the nature shows if you ever watched it. So the lion is coming close to the herd, and something really weird starts to happen. They start to pop up and leap high into the air like popcorn. You wonder, what the heck are they doing? Why waste all that time and why waste all that energy? Aren't you going to need that energy to run away? No. Actually, you don't need that energy to run away if you show the lion, as the lion is approaching, hey, you want to chase me? This is what you're up against. Okay? I intend to make it really tough for you to catch me. This is how high I can jump. This is how agile I am. This is how athletic I am. Chase the other guy next to me who can't do this. Okay? This is, A here especially, is the low stretch ritual that male elk and other male elk, male moose, these big, ungulates. A lot of times, most of the time, females would just prefer to stay away from the males because they're big, they have huge antlers, and they're belligerent most of the time. And so how does a male elk or moose get close enough for mating purposes? He has to demonstrate his intentions clearly. I'm not here to be aggressive, I'm here to be romantic. Okay? And the way he does that is with this submissive ritual behavior like this. Okay? And then finally, I think we've all seen this one, right? This is the play bow ritual of canines that they will use before a roughhouse play session. This is, again, very important to communicate intentions here. I intend to be playful. I'm committed to playing, not to fighting, because a lot of the stuff that's going to happen after this could be mistaken for real fighting. Growling, biting, chasing, nipping, all this kind of stuff. And this guy doesn't want the encounter to spin out of control. Right? And so we have to do a ritual first to show our intentions. So using ritualized behaviors as a mechanism for clearly displaying commitments and intentions, this goes much, much farther back than Homo sapiens. Okay? And because ritualized behaviors have such a deep evolutionary history, it's probably why they hit us at such a deep emotional level. Okay? Well, we are primates. We come from primate stock. Primates are very social species. We can look at non-human primates, our closest relatives, and see a whole rich array of ritual behaviors for regulating their social lives. And our ancestors would have possessed all of these different ritualized behaviors. So we're already coming from stock that is using ritual and ritualized behaviors for regulating social life. That's the begging ritual. Please share something with me. I'm submissive, don't fight. I don't want to fight anymore. I'm submitting to you, quit beating on me. That's what that means. I want to be friends, the grooming ritual. Okay. Oh yes, remember chimpanzees forage alone. But in the evenings, they'll come together as a group, and so they do this pant hoot ritual where they reaffirm the group. Okay, yes, I've been alone, I've been away from all you guys, but I'm a group member. Let's all reaffirm our membership to the group. Let's reaffirm the hierarchy. Okay, and so they do it by doing this group pant hooting when they meet at the end of the day. And I probably don't need to explain that one. Okay, that's a threat ritualized behavior. If you want to mess with me, I intend to use these. Okay, think about it. All right, I've been talking about ritual and ritualized behavior. Now I need to define what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's talk about how we identify ritual. What does it really mean? Right? And there's a problem with this because ritual is kind of like pornography. Right? And that is we know it when we see it, but trying to put a definition to it, a lot of times we start to get into arguments and controversy. And so what researchers have done is they've identified a list of traits. Okay? And so we're going to look at some of the traits that are used to identify ritualized behavior. And what we say then is the more we see these traits present, and the more obvious and clear they are, the more likely it is we are to say, oh, I'm in the presence of ritual. Okay? So what are the elements of ritual? Bang. All right, well, take an ordinary instrumental practical behavior. You want to play your trumpet. All right, well, there's a whole bunch of very practical gestures you're going to have to engage in order to do that utilitarian act, right? You're going to have to grip the horn, bring the horn up to your mouth, blow your lips, bring the horn down. All right? Those are ordinary behaviors designed to achieve just a very mundane practical end. But we can do those ordinary behaviors in an extraordinary way. So now think of a military bugler playing taps, right? And he takes all of those gestures and he formalizes them. Or he does them in this very intentional, deliberate sort of way. And you may have seen this. You know, he'll hold it in this very disciplined sort of way and bring it up very slow and snap it. And then when he's done, snap it back like this. Okay? That's what we refer to as formalization. Okay, so one of the first things we see in ritualized behaviors is that we take ordinary behaviors and we do them in this formal, intentional, deliberate, extraordinary way. And so the first thing we notice about ritual is, why is he doing it like that? All right, I mean, you don't have to do it like that to get it done. All right? Right, as soon as you notice that, you're seeing formal behaviors. And that's one of the first elements of ritual. Okay? Often these formal behaviors are then done repetitively. So if you stay with the military funeral idea, the gun salute that they often do. Okay, first think there's formal behaviors as the guys, you know, do what they do with their weapons. But they don't just do it once, right? They fire it off once and then go through the whole route and fire it off again. Okay, so there's repetition. Think of a baptism. You don't just dunk the head once, right? Once for the Father, once for the Son, once for the Holy Spirit. Okay. We think that the repetition of formalized behaviors is another mechanism that's used to try to attract and hold attention. Right? We're trying to get a message clearly across about intentions and commitments and values. Right? And we want to make sure that you get the message. So we're going to do it in this very deliberate, obvious way, and if you didn't get it the first time, I'll do it again. And if you didn't get it the second time, I'll do it a third time. Right? But I want to make sure that this message gets across. Invariant sequencing or scripting. Often then we will see that these formalized, repetitive gestures follow a script. There's rules about when you're supposed to do what and how many times, and that has to come before you do this that many times, and one bum 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 like this. There's a script that has to be followed in order to do these ritual acts correctly. Think of the Mass, right? There's a script you follow. You do these gestures, then you do that, then you do that. And if you start to ask, where did the script come from? Okay, most people are going to say, I don't know. We just always do it that way. Exactly, right? Often the script and the rules for how you're supposed to do these gestures goes off into the hazy history of the culture. It's just by tradition. But that sends a message when you do it the right way, right? Okay, you're saying, I follow tradition. I respect tradition. Simply by following the script, a message is sent about what you're committed to, what your values are. Goal to motion. Another thing that we see about ritualized behaviors is that the focus is simply doing the behavior itself properly, right? So when we ritually wash something, we're not trying to get it clean, right? Instead, we're simply trying to do the act correctly so that we can pay respect to whatever the object is. Or if you're the meditator, what's the first thing you learn? Just concentrate on your breathing. All right? Maybe you'll have a mystical experience at the end of all this, but no, that's not what you worry about. What we're going to try to train you to do right now is just breathe right. Okay? And so it's simply doing the gestures properly that is the goal to motion. right? We're not trying to achieve some end here. The only end we're trying to achieve is do the acts properly. Focus on the acts and make sure the acts are done right. Anything that happens after that, fine. Okay. So where we see formalized, repeated, scripted, goal-demoted actions, and the more we tend to see those things, the more we then say, I am in the presence of ritual. Okay? And something more than just an ordinary practical behavior is being done here. And then we have to figure out, well, what more is it? What is it they're trying to tell us? Just because we formalize something and we follow a script and we do it repetitively doesn't necessarily mean that the intentions and the commitments that we are displaying are honest. Ritualized behaviors can be used deceptively. Right? And in fact, chimpanzees like to do that. That's the begging gesture. And usually it means I give up, you're bigger and stronger than me, quit beating on me. Okay, but primatologists have documented where you'll have a chimpanzee, two chimpanzees are having an encounter, one of them does the begging gesture, and the other one relaxes and says, oh, I won. Boom, surprise attack, right? Okay, it can be used deceptively to try to get advantage or to manipulate someone. And now comes the favorite part of my talk. So that's low-cost begging, right? Baboons, on the other hand, have come up with a high-cost gesture, high-cost ritual act for ensuring trust amongst male coalitions. One of the things that male baboons will do is they will form these partnerships or coalitions, and then the partnership or the coalition will go attack the alpha male. Okay? Two of us can take him out. Right? Or they'll go attack another male coalition. Well, how are you going to make sure that when you create this alliance with your buddy, he ain't going to cut and run when the action starts? How can you ensure that he's really honest in his intentions? Don't have him do a begging gesture, low cost. Make it a costly ritual, right? And the scrotum grasp is about as costly as you can get, okay? When primates fight, male primates, they don't mess around. They go right for the genitals and try to pull them off. Right? And so to voluntarily put your reproductive success literally in the hands of another male baboon, there's a risk. There's a script they follow, though. They'll stride up to each other with a certain kind of stride. They'll engage in affiliative behaviors, lip smacking. They'll do a little grooming. And after they've gotten to that point, after they both followed the script and indicated to each other, yes, we want to form this coalition, they'll each present their backside and allow the other one to do a grab. Okay? And what primatologists have found is that those baboons that manage to get through the scrotum grasp ritual typically do back up each other when there are some kinds of conflicts or that sort of thing. So it tends to work. Okay, cost. So you have to have cost. If we look at religious rituals today, one of the things we can notice about them is that they continue to exact a cost. Which is probably one of the reasons, again, why religion and supernatural belief became a human universal and why it still continues to have effects today. So, like what? What kinds of costs do we see? Time. A good Muslim has to stop whatever he's doing 5 times a day and pray. And I'm told that most Muslims don't pray. So if you see somebody actually stopping and doing this, you scratch your head and you go, gee, that guy's serious about this business. Okay? He's willing to pay the cost. Risk. Consider the snake handling practices of some Appalachian Pentecostals or some Hindu rituals which require body piercing with skewers and needles and so forth. Money. Hey, we only have to go to Mass once a week, but every time you go, pony up. Right? Pass around the plate, give a little money. Energy. Wednesday night choir practice, at least in some denominations, can be pretty energetic. And so while you're expending all your energy there, you're not expending it out running around, carousing, or doing whatever else you could be doing. And then finally, public reputation. Orthodox male Jews are required to do thrice daily public prayer. Okay, and so if you have to do it in public, you see who's showing up and who's not showing up. Okay. You also see who's showing up and then going off and doing things that go against Orthodox teaching. So being a hypocrite becomes part of the risk of this. What benefit then emerges from all of this cost associated with religious rituals? Increased group cohesion. All kinds of studies showing that as you engage in costly rituals, that increases the various traits and characteristics of individuals that make them better group members, and therefore add to the cohesion of the group. For example, one study looked at those who left offerings at a sacred ritual site and those who didn't. And those who left offerings were regarded as being more trustworthy than those that didn't. Those who moved in synchrony with others, and I'm going to talk more about synchronous movement in a second, all kinds of synchronous movement associated with religious rituals, kneeling together, praying together, singing together, chanting together, and so forth. Those who moved in synchrony with others were more generous with the others that they moved in synchrony with compared to those who didn't move in synchrony. Okay. Those who engaged in public prayer were more generous than those who only engaged in private prayer. Finally, those who engaged in high ordeal ritual, like body piercing, gave more to a public fund for their group, and they had a stronger emotional attachment to their group compared to those who only engaged in low-cost ritual. Okay, so as you bump up the cost, the commitment that individuals have to the group and to what the group stands for increases, and the group is strengthened. Probably the best way, the most effective way that you can get a bunch of folks to emotionally bond together and to be willing to sacrifice for each other is get them to move in synchrony. Okay? Think about military situations. Why in the heck does the Army still have guys going out marching all the time? Marching into battle has got to be the stupidest strategy you could ever use nowadays. It's been a stupid strategy ever since the cannon's been around. Okay? Why do they still have them march? Because if you march together and move in synchrony together, you'll die for the guy that you're marching next to. Nothing seems to create this powerful emotional bond where they're willing to sacrifice for each other, like moving in synchrony. We see it in a lot of religious rituals, revivals, and that sort of thing. These are the All Blacks, New Zealand, their rugby club. They always do the traditional haka dance before they go into battle on the rugby field. And you can't find a traditional society that isn't singing, dancing, and chanting together just about on a daily basis. Okay. One study looked at synchronous movement, but then also wanted to ask the question, what happens when you have synchronous movement, but then you also add the supernatural to it? Okay. And what happens is that you have the very strong emotional bonding, but then what you add to it is this idea of sacredness. Okay? And that is the folks that are moving together in this religious setting, they start to see the values and the commitments that are being represented in the ritual, not just as being arbitrary sorts of things that we all think are a good idea, but instead as being sacred things that have been sent down on high. And because they are sacred things, that increases the intensity of their cooperation compared to secular groups. Oh, the sustaining power of ritual. Okay, pretty much everything I've talked about up to this point has looked at ritual and its effects at the group level, okay, how it makes groups stronger. Now what I want to look at is the effects of ritual at the individual level. It turns out that ritual isn't just great for groups. It doesn't just take groups and turn them into these very cohesive tribes. The other thing that it does is it actually is good for the individuals themselves, personal benefits for the individuals who are doing the rituals. And this becomes another part of the argument as to why ritual had such an important effect over our evolutionary history. It wasn't just good at the group level. Individuals that did it gained benefits. So I'm not just helping my group, I'm helping myself at the same time. Okay? There's a lot of benefits that ritual has for individuals. I only have time to mention one, okay? And that's what I call the sustaining power or the strengthening power of ritual. Ritual makes individuals stronger. That strong. This is the Tummo meditation that some Tibetan monks will engage in so that they can then sit out on frozen mountaintops for hours meditating. In fact, some of these guys, you may have seen the YouTube videos where some of these guys, they'll take wet towels, throw them on their backs, and they'll dry them. Okay? That's how powerful they get using their ritual behaviors. Well, what about just ordinary folks? Well, I'll give you two ordinary folks, Roberto Canessa and Nando Parado. These were just two ordinary teenagers. Okay, nothing extraordinary about them. But in order to survive, they had to take this 10-day trek across the Andes Mountains, which included climbing a 15,000-foot mountain peak. How do you do that, especially after you've been through already an 8-week or whatever it was, a 9-week ordeal stranded in the mountains? Right? Well, the way they did it was ritual prayer. Okay? Parado describes the suffering that they went through and then also how they coped. Okay? Roberto was nearing the end of his strength. My strength was fading too. Painful cramps had seized my legs, making every step an agony. We were walking ourselves to death. Now he describes how they coped. My mind had narrowed until there was no room in my consciousness for anything but the next stride. Gold emotion, right? Don't worry about the end result. Just worry about doing the gesture right. Focus on that. It was a kind of self-hypnosis, probably brought on by the mesmerizing effects of my rhythmic breathing, the repetitive crunch of my boots on the rocks and snow, right? So there's the repetition and the rhythm that he gets into, and the litany of Hail Marys that I constantly chanted. That's from his book. If you're wondering what MITA, Miracle in the Andes, that was the name of his book that he wrote some years later, many decades after the event. And we can demonstrate that supernatural ritual actually does have strengthening effects. All right? So in this study, religious and non-religious subjects, devout Catholics and non-believers, were given electric shock. But as they were given electric shock, they were allowed to contemplate different images. And so a religious image, the Madonna, and a non-religious image, a painting of a woman by Rembrandt. Okay? And as they were contemplating that image and receiving electric shock, they gave subjective ratings of the intensity of the pain, and then also subjective ratings of their mood. And so how did it come out? Here's how it came out. Here's the non-religious group, and it doesn't matter which image they are contemplating. They rate the pain high and the same across the two conditions. Here's the religious group. When they're contemplating the non-religious image, they're the same as the non-religious folks. Significant drop in their subjective rating of the pain when they were contemplating the religious image. And then also a significant increase in their mood when they're contemplating the religious image. Ritual strengthens individuals. Okay, talked about religion at the level of the group. Talked about ritual at the level of the group. Talked about ritual at the level of the individual. Talk about ritual at the level of the species. Okay, and how ritual saved humanity. All right, well, to do that, I got to give you a real brief overview of human evolution, which I promise will be real quick but hopefully effective. All right, and so the first thing I need you to do is I need you to, if you want, close your eyes, but you need to envision the Earth 10 million years ago. So just go back in your mind and think Earth 10 million years ago, okay? And also then locate your thinking on Africa and think about the central band of Africa, right in the center of Africa, and there is unbroken tropical rainforest from the east to the west coast, okay, at this time, about 10 million years ago. There also is this rather small ape. Think of a small chimpanzee. And this thing could have swung without ever touching the ground from one coast to the other, because that's how thick this rainforest is, going across the central band of Africa. This is also a single population of ape that occupies this entire territory. Okay? But starting 10 million years ago, something's happening, climate change. And it's affecting the eastern part of Africa more than the western part. And so in the east, the unbroken forest is starting to get broken up. It's starting to become a patchwork over the next 5 million years or so. So you still have some areas which are pretty thickly forested, but you also have it interspersed with these open grasslands. And so the eastern apes have to deal with this changing ecosystem. The central and western apes can continue pretty much to live the same old lifestyle. Okay? So now this, what was once a single population, is starting to break into separate populations, follow their own evolutionary trajectories. Okay? If we follow the central and the western apes for the next 5 million years or so, forward to present time, they evolve into the chimpanzees, the gorillas, and the bonobos that we know in Africa today. If we follow the eastern apes forward in time, they eventually evolve into us, Homo sapiens. So we are descendants of the eastern apes that had to deal with this radically changing ecosystem. Okay? And for the first couple million years, For the first couple million years here, these two squares here. The biggest thing we can say about how they adapted to this changing ecosystem is they went upright. They became bipedal apes. Okay. As far as their brains were concerned and their overall lifestyles, they're still pretty much doing the same thing. But they're upright. They're walking on two legs. Okay. It's not until we get about 2 million years ago that you start to cross a threshold. The brain is expanding. The body is now evolving into something which looks much more human-like than ape-like. And so with such species as Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, we're looking at something that we can say is more human-like than ape-like. Whereas everything before that, all the Australopiths, early members of the genus Homo, we would say those things they're much more ape-like than human-like. But we crossed a threshold with these guys, erectus, ergaster, so forth. Okay. If we continue to move forward in time, we get into this last square here. We end up about 1 million years ago, moving forward, and there's probably about 4 or 5 hominid species left. Okay. Homo sapiens are going to emerge quite late in the whole game, not until about 200,000 years ago. Okay. But when Homo sapiens emerged, there were still 4 or 5 probably other hominids running around the globe. Okay. They were not alone. These are some of the earliest skulls that are attributed to our species. In Africa, Homo sapiens emerged in Africa. Okay, they're an African species. For the first 100,000 years or so, if you were an anthropologist Martian looking down on Earth, and you saw these Homo sapiens running around Africa, and you saw the other hominid species running around other parts of the globe, you probably would have not noticed anything about Homo sapiens that would make you think there's anything special about them, anything different. If you had to make a prediction, gee, there's only going to be one soon, who's it going to be? You'd just flip the coin, okay? Because there's nothing for the first 100,000 years that really distinguishes Homo sapiens in any way. And just to put an exclamation point on this, the first major move that Homo sapiens make out of Africa is into this area, what's called the Levant, okay, which is where present-day Israel and Syria and the Sinai Peninsula and Lebanon, where all that is. About 100,000 years ago, so they emerged 200,000 years ago, about 100,000 years are confined to Africa largely. Then at about 100,000 years ago, first major move out. First major move out is into the Levant. They establish themselves for a couple thousand years, and then something interesting happens. And that is it starts to cool. Neanderthals start to move down from the north, and Homo sapiens get out of town. They move back into Africa. They give up the territory. That's how average they were. Okay? But another interesting observation to make about this Levant incident here is that this never happens again. This never happens again. The next time Homo sapiens make a move out of Africa and they establish themselves, nothing moves them out. Okay? They move everything else out. They displace or replace any other hominids. Okay? So Homo sapiens moved back into Africa about 100,000 years ago. For about the next 40,000 years, 100,000 years ago to about 60,000 years ago, they remained again confined to Africa. Then they make their second major move, beginning about 60,000 years ago, out of Africa. And now, these guys, 40,000 years later, when they move anywhere across the globe, they take out all competing species. They take territory and they never give it back. Any other hominids there, they replace them. Okay? And they eventually become, as we now know, the singular hominid across the globe. So what made the difference? Well, the difference, we're going to see, had very little to do with physics. Okay? The brain is pretty much the same. The body is pretty much the same. The biggest change is going to be social. They are going to be a much more socially sophisticated Homo sapien the second time they move out. Well, one thing we know is when they went back into Africa, that period of time from 100,000 years ago to 60,000 years ago was a tough time. Genetic evidence indicates we went through a very severe population bottleneck, probably down to maybe 2,000 to 3,000 breeding females, as close to extinction as we have ever come. Times were tough in Africa during this period. Okay? And not all Homo sapiens survived. In fact, only a small group of Homo sapiens survived this bottleneck, a group that we are all descended from. Another interesting thing we can find that happens during this period of time is we start to have some of the first archaeological evidence of widespread trading, intergroup trading networks. Okay? It's as if these remaining Homo sapiens who are dying out, some of them finally started to figure out, you know what, there ain't much left around here, and it really is stupid to keep fighting with those guys over the hill. Maybe we got to make peace with those guys over the hill, and maybe if we work together and trade and share the scarce resources that are left, we can survive. Okay. And what else do we have around this time? Well, those are the Tsitolo Hills in central Botswana. And in the Tsitolo Hills in central Botswana, we have Rhino Cave. And in Rhino Cave, we have a natural outcropping, which is often referred to as the snake rock or the serpent rock. Okay. What's interesting about the serpent rock is that archaeologists have studied it. It has been intentionally modified to enhance its serpent-like appearance. And as best as we can date those intentional modifications, they date to around 70,000 years ago. It's a very dark environment. Archaeologists that have gone in there with just torchlight, okay, and have observed the snake rock under conditions that our ancestors would have observed it just with torchlight, they said it almost has an undulating movement to it. Okay? And they said it is very conducive to shamanistic type rituals. Many of us think that shamanism is probably the oldest religious practice amongst Homo sapiens. And one of the central features of shamanistic rituals is an altered state of consciousness. Okay? Shamans will put themselves into an altered state so that they can then connect with the spiritual world. And it just so happens that this environment is very conducive to altered states of consciousness. And so some, including myself, have argued that this may have been the venue for some of the first shamanistic rituals that humans ever engaged in. But that's not the only interesting thing we find at Rhino Cave. All scattered on the floor below the serpent rock are multitudes of broken, burnt, destroyed tools made from exotic materials. What do we mean by exotic materials? Raw materials, rock, certain kinds of rock, that were brought from 100 kilometers away or more to Rhino Cave. Once brought to Rhino Cave, the Homo sapiens that were in there fashioned them into tools. So they took the time, energy, and effort to make these things into tools. And then what did they do with the tools made from these expensive, exotic materials that took who knows how long to create into tools? They threw them in the fire. They stomped on them. They broke them. They destroyed them. What a waste of time, energy, and effort. You ever go to a wedding where they smash the glasses after they had the toast? What a waste of time, energy, and effort. Yeah, that's exactly the hallmark of costly ritual, right? And so one, including myself, have tried to make the case that this looks like one of the first venues where costly rituals of a shamanistic nature may very well have been taking place. Why would they be doing that? Maybe to solidify an alliance with an outgroup that you've been competitive with for all these years? And now, hey, if we're going to survive, we got to figure out, can we trust each other? Can we form a trading alliance and share what's left of these scarce resources? Do you believe in the same gods I do? Okay, maybe we can do a ritual. And at the end of that, mark ourselves and trust each other. Well, these more socially sophisticated Homo sapiens then started to move out of Africa, starting 60,000 years ago. They started to move all over the globe in the old world. At first especially, okay? And they started to encounter other hominid species. Where that encounter is best documented is in Europe, where they encountered Neanderthals, right? And in very short order replaced them. The same Neanderthals that 40,000 years earlier had moved them out of the Levant. Okay? And if you would have asked the question, okay, why did we replace them? The answer you would have gotten, say, 20 years ago is, well, we were smarter than they are. Okay, there were big cognitive differences. A lot of the evidence for those big cognitive differences has eroded. Okay, we don't think we were that much smarter than they were anymore. But the evidence for social and ritual differences persists. Okay, now, how do we look in the archaeological record and try to determine rituals were being practiced, 50,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago? What archaeologists do is they look for artifacts which we know are associated with ritual activity in traditional societies today. Okay, and artifacts like beads. Okay, traditional societies, traditional hunter-gatherers today will use beads in all kinds of ritual activities. They use them to ornament their bodies. They use them in burial. They use them in various sorts of ceremonies or ritual gift-giving. Okay, and we do see that both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens gathered and fashioned beads. But these are some of the totals that we're finding at different Homo sapiens and Neanderthal sites. At some Homo sapien sites, we're finding hundreds of beads, up to 1,000. These are the highest quantity numbers that we find at Neanderthal sites. Okay, so I'm not cherry picking here. I tried to find, okay, what's the most? And the most we can find is Grada du Rennes, 36 beads. And that's controversial. Okay, there are those who would argue we can't attribute all those to Neanderthals. But let's say we can. It's still orders of magnitude less than what we're finding at some Homo sapien sites. So whatever they're doing with beads, assuming that some of it is ritual, Homo sapiens are spending a lot more time, energy, and effort doing it than these guys. Red ochre is a substance, a mineral substance, which is associated with ritual behavior in traditional societies. There you see the mineral substance itself, and you can see it can be ground into a powder. You add liquid to it, it becomes a pigment. And you can paint your body, paint your tools, engage in ceremonies, dances, whatever. And we see traditional societies do this quite a bit. Okay. And we know that both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals gathered red ochre. But here you're looking at numbers of sites, at least back in 2015 when I did this, that are associated with Homo sapiens, the diamonds. Okay. Neanderthals, but a handful. And also the totals. We have a number of Homo sapien sites where the total number of red ochre pieces that we're finding is above 1,000. We have but one site of Neanderthals where it's above 1,000 pieces. And again, that's the Grada du Rennes site, which is controversial. We're not sure we can attribute all of that red ochre collection to Neanderthals. But whatever they're doing with red ochre, Homo sapiens are doing a heck of a lot more of it. Okay. Ritual burial. Right. We know that in traditional societies, burial is often associated with ritualized behavior of one kind or another. And we know that both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals deliberately buried some of their dead. This is the old man of Chapelle-Alsace, Neanderthal burial. Okay, and most paleoanthropologists that have studied this are content to say that it is a deliberate burial. Okay, and also we find tools and some animal bones with the human remains there. And some have argued that might have been part of some kind of ritual that was used when the body was interred. But it's ambiguous. We can't be absolutely certain of that. Natural processes could have led to those animal bones and those tools being deposited with the bones. Okay, so they argue about it. But that's about the best case for Neanderthal ritual burial that you can make. Absolutely nothing in the Neanderthal archaeological record that comes close to some Homo sapiens burials, like the Sungir burial in Russia, dated to about 28,000 years ago. 3 bodies were interred there with literally thousands and thousands of beads, painted with red ochre. The labor hours, it is estimated, to be able to create all of these things that went with the burial is into the tens of thousands of hours. Tools were also found there. But tools can be ambiguous, right? It was ambiguous with the old man of Chapelle. It ain't ambiguous with Sungir because they're miniature tools. Tools that you could not go out and hunt with, made of ivory, which is too soft a material. These are ornamental tools. Okay? And they're spending a tremendous amount of effort and energy. Much more so than anything we can find in the Neanderthal archaeological record. And then finally, deep cave sites are another venue for ritualized activity. Artwork and ritual associated with art. We have scores and scores of examples of Homo sapiens going into deep cave sites to do art and probably ritual activity associated with the art. Okay. And sometimes these ventures took them 1 kilometer or more deep into the cave. This ain't today. This is 20,000, 30,000 years ago. You're going in with torches. It's dark. It's dangerous. Sometimes you have to ford over streams. Sometimes you have to climb up sheer rock faces to get to where you're going. Sometimes you have to descend deep, dark caverns. Torches that you're carrying with you, artistic supplies you're carrying with you, little children coming in with you. Yes, they brought their children with them on a regular basis when they went in and did this stuff. Okay? No question this is risky, dangerous behavior, and yet Homo sapiens were doing it over and over and over again. We have but one example of Neanderthals going more than 100 meters deep into a cave at Bruniquel Cave. They went 200 meters deep into the cave. It wasn't easy to get into the cave. They had to crawl through some narrow passages. Once they got into a spot in the cave where they had a reasonably level floor, they broke off stalactites and stalagmites, formed them into two circles, and built a fire in the bigger of the two circles. Did whatever they did and left. Some bear bones have been found there, and so some have argued this might have been the first venue for some kind of bear cult rituals amongst Neanderthals. But that's it. Okay? Neanderthals did use caves a lot, but they always stayed near the front of the cave at the entrance. They were smart enough not to go into the deep darkness of it. Okay? If we do just a really cursory, superficial sort of comparison between what some have argued the first Neanderthal supernatural ritual cave site and the first Homo sapien deep cave ritual site, the cost differences are obvious. Okay? Neanderthals went into the cave, used materials that were already present in the cave, did what they did and left. Homo sapiens brought materials from 100 kilometers or more to the cave, fashioned them into tools, then destroyed them and broke them in the cave. Okay? So by every metric that we can use to try to measure ritual behavior, Homo sapiens are expending more time, energy, and effort doing the ritual than Neanderthals. And we know that it is costly ritual that builds cohesive, tight, tribal communities. And so I think it was this difference that made the difference when Homo sapiens started to move throughout the globe and encounter other hominids. We weren't smarter than they were. We were more well organized than they were because we engaged in ritual behavior to create this self-sacrificial mind, this tribal mind. And the other hominids didn't have that kind of mind. But I think ritual is even more than that. If you haven't got the message yet that I think ritual is really, really, really cool, okay, and that it is through ritual that we express the highest levels of our humanity. We give up something of our humanity when we give up ritual. Okay? If I haven't gotten that across, then I'll try to get this one across. I think we do even one more thing with ritual. We try to defy nature itself. Okay? We try to rob nature of the last word. We want to have the last word through ritual. Whatever happens to us, we want ritual to have the last word, not nature. So, hey, it's nature that decides when a baby is born, right? But it's ritual that decides when that new life is admitted to our community. You can't find a traditional society that doesn't have all kinds of rituals associated with pregnancy and childbirth. It's nature that decides when the body is an adult body and no longer a child's body, right? But it's ritual that decides when we as a community admit you as an adult with adult responsibilities. Okay? Hard to find a traditional society that doesn't have initiation rites of some kind for adolescents. We don't care if you have pubic hair. Do our rituals, then we'll call you an adult. Nature decides our lusts and our desires, right? But it's ritual that decides who our legitimate partner is. And in the end, it's nature that takes the life away. But it's ritual that decides when we dismiss you from our community. Okay? This is the memorial that the Andes survivors built, 12,000 feet high in the mountains at the crash site. I showed you the picture of the rescue helicopters and the guys cheering. That was the end of their ordeal. That was the end of their ordeal. It wasn't the end of the event. Okay? Nature may have started the event, but the survivors, a group of them with a Catholic priest, went back up to the site, built that memorial, said a funeral mass, and then said, now it's over. We say it's over with our rituals. Okay? Homo sapiens, I think, are the only species that takes offense at nature's indifference to our suffering, our circumstances, to whatever it throws at us. It doesn't care. Okay? Ritual, then, is the mark that we leave testifying to that offense. So there you go, my friends. I hope I've convinced you that ritual makes us human. So,
all right, time for questions. I'm going to bring the microphone around. Shay, if you'll take this side, I'll take the other.
I'll leave that up there.
We have two microphones to make it easy.
Would you equate ritual with religion? If not, how do you differentiate?
No, they aren't the same thing. You can have secular rituals that have nothing to do with the supernatural. But I think that there is a very tight overlap between the two of them because I think what our ancestors found is that if you're going to communicate with the gods, you need to do it in a very clear, effective way that is effectively communicating your intentions, right? If I'm going to send a message, I want to make sure the message gets sent in the right way. I don't want the spirits and the ancestors and the gods to get the wrong message, like that I'm being disrespectful, or that I whatever. So I think ritual and ritualized behaviors became very strongly associated with that because the communication and the clarity of the communication was deemed to be so important, and so the two of them then have great overlap. And then also you have the other point that I was trying to make, which is if you're going to have cost associated with some of these rituals so that you can show your commitment, a great motivator is the supernatural. And to get people to do these things, the convincing way you can get them to do it is to say, look, folks, it's not just us. Your ancestors, your grandparents, they're all watching you. So, suck it up and get it done. Yeah.
How would you say, I'm trying to think of how to formulate this question, but in terms of the cost for ritual, it seems like the cost for a lot of our rituals has diminished greatly over time, which is a good thing, right? In some ways. But like for our students, I think a lot of them don't see a cost to the rituals that they go through. For instance, confirmation, right? They just go through it kind of out of a rote kind of, my parents want me to do it, so I'm going to do it. And they don't really put a lot of thought into that, right? I think I have a lot of students who have Agnes as their confirmation name, and the cynical part of me thinks it's because the first female saint that appears in the lives of the saints, right? But how do you reclaim some of that ritualized behavior in, kind of reclaim that sacredness with the ritual if people aren't really taking it seriously? How do you do that?
Well, that's a challenge. I think one of the things that might be helpful is to look historically at the role of initiation rituals. And I think that's what we're trying to do with confirmation and some other rituals is that this is a rite of inclusion. In the Jewish tradition, the bar mitzvah, this is when the boy is first allowed to read Torah publicly and be part of the male prayer group. And those are essential aspects of being part of the religious community. If you can't pass the rituals and therefore be admitted into the community to do these things, you're not part of the community. I think that the level of that seriousness is harder to try to present in a convincing way, other than to say that, look, if you want to seriously be taken as an adult, throughout our whole history, there have been some kinds of initiations, some kind of rituals that demonstrate your quality. And this is what we have in our community. And if you don't take it seriously, you truly are letting the community down. And then try to work from there. I think kids, well, maybe I'm wrong, but I generally think kids like ritual. And so I think if you can tap into that love of ritual early on and get that ingrained in them, maybe when they reach that point, it's an easier sell to make. And the idea that throughout all of history, there's always been a threshold. This is your threshold to cross. And the threshold is something that the community does out of concern, not out of trying to necessarily weed people out and exclude them, but make sure that they are ready to be included.
Another question.
Great. I should give credit. I overheard you guys coming in distinguishing evolution versus the use of the word evolution as a natural selection process versus evolution as more of a social process. In other words, so when you say that these rituals have evolved, are you implying that there is a genetic mutation which is then selected because of its fortuitousness, or rather that it was a social behavior that was selected because it helped the society?
Well, there's a concept that is being used more and more by evolutionists, which is this idea of gene culture coevolution, right? That genes and cultures co-evolve. And you can demonstrate that cultural practices can exert enough of a selection pressure that they can have effects on the genetics of the individuals that are part of that culture. Probably, the lactase tolerance, intolerance is the biggest example of that they'll use, where a culture that then adopts milk dairying as part of their diet, they're actually then selecting certain individuals within their population who are more able to process that. And so that's why you see we have lactose tolerance into adulthood, right? Because we come from dairying cultures where you have other cultures that the lactose gene will get turned off by the time the person is an adult because they only got their lactose by breastfeeding, right? So we can demonstrate that cultural practices, depending on the type of practice, it can have a selective effect on the individuals. And so it can very well be the case that if rituals are regular enough, if they have very specific sorts of requirements, like they require someone to be able to exert self-control, like in some very taxing initiation rituals, that those individuals that have the genetic makeup that make them more able to demonstrate self-control, to not, let their emotions get the best of them and they start running away afraid or something like that, that those individuals have an advantage in getting through the rituals. And if the ritual then ensures some kind of higher status within the group, that then has an effect on reproductive success. Okay? Now, I'm not saying all rituals do that, but if you start looking at our ancestral past, and I showed you some images there, you can find rituals that were pretty taxing and did require certain personality traits, physical characteristics, emotional characteristics for individuals to successfully get through those rituals. So yes, rituals can have a selective effect. They can become part of the cultural environment that then selects out individuals and gives advantages to certain individuals in terms of reproduction over other individuals.
Thanks.
One of the things you'd mentioned was, I guess, the Western hominids seem to develop these ritual tendencies because they were under duress in some sense from the environment.
Well, you mean the African?
I'm sorry, the African,
okay,
yes.
Okay.
And kind of pairing off one of the other questions, I'm wondering if you think that there is a connection then between almost level of conflict that a society faces and the amount of ritual that takes place. Today there seems to be some sort of skepticism, I'd say, about ritual, at least religious rituals in our own civilization. And I think about places where you tend to see it, or I think of it most frequently would be in the military or in sporting events.
Yes.
Which are heavily ritualized, but usually oriented towards some sort of conflict or combat. In that, would you tend to see a decline in affluent societies of ritualized behavior, or does it just manifest itself in other ways?
Well, when we look at traditional societies, the answer to your question is yes. Where traditional societies are under more ecological stress, resources are harder to get to, or more intergroup conflict, we see an increase in ritual behavior. So that's certainly true. I think it is also true that ritual tends to decline with affluence. I don't know of any studies that have been able to look specifically at that because there's so many confounding kinds of variables that play into it. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if that were the case. Because we have so many ways now of selecting trustworthy others. We have laws, and we have lawyers, and we have punishments for individuals that try to scam us or do that sort of thing. And you didn't have that in the ancestral past. In the ancestral past, your personal knowledge of somebody and then also their ritual markings, that's how you would make a judgment about the character of that individual. And therefore, whether you wanted to carry on some kind of relationship with that individual, go hunting with that individual or gathering or whatever, could you trust them? One of the things that we've done in modern societies is try to find ways outside of ritual to make those same assurances. So we check to see if the babysitter has some kind of whatever certification. She knows how to do CPR or something like that. So the marketplace and the government and laws and those sorts of things are now acting in a way that ritual used to act in our ancestral past. And so then in some ways squeezing ritual out of its larger place. Whether that's good or bad, I mean, you can see that, we have, our society in general is a lot more affluent and offers us a lot more services and that sort of thing. So in that sense, you can say, gee, it's really good. But I don't think, have the same kind of depth of relationship with others that we see in more traditional agrarian, kinds of ritual societies. So yeah, I guess the answer to your question is yes. I think ritual is diminished, and in many ways that's worrisome. But I think there still is a place for it amongst those individuals that want it and see its value. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Do you think there's going to be...
Amanda, one second. Jeremy was. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'll wait.
No, go ahead, you go. Do you think there's going to be a tipping point in modern society where we've lost so much of our ritualistic ability or ritual behaviors that the society really starts to unravel?
Yeah, that's one of the big reasons why societies lose cohesion is because they can't agree on the rituals they want to practice. So, I mean, I think you can see it to some extent in America right now, where we used to be far more cohesive because there were many things that we all agreed on, and we could. I'm thinking of the presidential inauguration. I think in the past, whether you were Republican, Democrat, or whatever, you could look at that ritual act as a reaffirmation of the presidency and the whole country, and even if you didn't necessarily vote for the person, you still might want to participate just because this is a celebration of American democracy. I don't think I've seen that happening in the last couple inaugurations. And so because we can't come together in the same way and celebrate this nationwide ritual activity, I think is a reflection or a manifestation of the fragmentation that's been occurring for many generations, or many decades, I guess I should say. But I also think something else, and that is, I tend to believe in, you have an overall culture, but then you have subcultures. And I tend to think that subcultures tend to emerge out of more fragmentation in the general culture. And so I don't see ritual going away, just like I don't see the Amish going away, or Orthodox Jews going away. In fact, those are two groups that are actually expanding quite effectively. I think what starts to happen is that as the larger culture starts to drop generalized rituals that everybody used to engage in, subcommunities start to take hold of those things, and they start to use them in a much more local context. Christmas. I've watched Christmas diminish in my lifetime, where I can remember in my hometown, where there would be Christmas displays all over town, at the courthouse and everything. And my university used to have, can't do that anymore, And so the general society has lost this common practice, this common affirmation of something, and maybe it has to because it's changing, you know. I mean, it was a different world 50 years ago than it is today. But I don't think that means Christmas is gone and all the ritual practices around it. I think it just then privatizes more. It becomes more local. It becomes my group that does my thing in our way, in our little community, and we gain benefit out of that, but the larger community doesn't share in that anymore. So it's a more fragmented world. We end up, and rituals become more localized, but they don't die, I don't think. Okay? But I think that's where you end up, is that you end up, you want to keep these things alive, you think there's value in them, you think that this is really the way that we expressed our highest levels of humanity, then we keep them alive in this smaller way, and maybe they grow from there at some point, but that seems to be the direction of things. Yeah.
Let's,
Just because it followed up with what you said.
okay, yeah, hold on one second. No one, yeah, for the video, we need people to use the mic.
So I apologize, everyone. You said it creates more fragmentation. Is that what the word that we want to use, though? That seems to have it seems negative if we say it's fragmented, but it seems, I don't know, when you're talking about it, it seems like that's creating a little bit more diversity. So now you have all these different groups, but they're all practicing different things, which seems to be a good thing.
I suppose it could be. Yeah, I'm not trying to pass a judgment one way or the other. I'm simply trying to describe. And I think you could call it fragmented in the sense that at one time there was general agreement about how we do these things. And now that agreement is gone. And so we have these guys doing it this way over here and these guys doing it that way. And so we don't have uniformity. So whatever the opposite of uniformity is, it could be fragmentation, it could be diversity, however you want to. I'm not trying to pass a judgment on it. And if my words were judgmental, I didn't really mean it that way. But it does pose a greater challenge for keeping the whole society together, right? Because if we can't agree, you know, if we don't have these general agreements on things, then it's harder for everybody to work together and trust each other, and trying to solve larger problems becomes much more challenging. Because these guys want to do it this way and those guys want to do it that way, and we end up not doing anything. Yeah.
Thank you.
Matt, I really appreciated what you did here, and I found it extremely helpful. I have a question that picks up on a couple of different threads that are going on here, and that is, it seems to me like there's a kind of a circle with certain kinds of social experience or social space fit together with ritual and are reinforced by it, and in those contexts, ritual really works and makes sense. So you mentioned the Orthodox Jews and the rites of passage, and somebody over here mentioned teams and the military and so forth. Well, those are environments where you have clear boundaries and clear internal status, right? And so the ritual makes sense to the people who are participating as a way of communicating all that. And in that connection, you mentioned the thing about, well, the affluence maybe seems to erode this, and that's the point of my question. And I wonder if it's affluence or if it's affluence kind of married to a kind of individualistic social experience or
Yes.
social space. Because like the English upper class was always affluent, but highly ritualized. But our individualism isn't connected to our family. Our affluence isn't connected to family belonging or whatever. It individualizes, it atomizes our society. And I wonder if that has something to do with why ritual breaks down for us and doesn't feel or it feels artificial.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with you 100%. And it probably is, to a greater extent, individualism. And the fact that I think market forces and other sorts of forces encourage individualism. You are unique, therefore you need this particular product. Right. And American individualistic culture is a poison for ritual in many ways. It's a poison for communal rituals. You can still have individual rituals. You know, I can do my particular little rituals that I like to do before I go to bed, or whatever, for breakfast. But as far as building community, then yeah, individualism, it works against community and the rituals that community uses to try to have cohesion of some kind. Yeah, that's a big problem. Well, and the other thing that I thought of as you were talking about, clear boundaries, and maybe that's something that has to be cultivated to an even greater extent for rituals to be more successful within the Catholic community. And that is, hey, look at these Orthodox Jews. Maybe there are some lessons that we can learn from these guys about successful community and successful ritual and taking rituals seriously and all that kind of stuff. And maybe part of that is that you need a clear identity. We are a clear, separate group, different from others, respectful of others, but different. And this is your tribe. And if you want to be part of this tribe, these are the rites that you go through and the rituals that you go through.
It feels to me on that, the psalmist says, "Why have you broken down its walls?" And it feels like, in a way, we broke down our own walls. We used to have markers like the Friday abstinence and things like that we voluntarily gave away.
Yep.
And then marveled as our children had no sense of belonging to this big thing that was so important to us. Or Catholic neighborhoods.
Somebody along the line mentioned something about ritual cost has gone down and that's good, or something, and no. Yeah, ritual.
Referring to not being hung from your pectoral muscles. That was what I was referring to as the good part,
Yeah. But ritual cost in the sense of I'm doing something that's obviously taking effort, and therefore I have to, in my own mind, think, why am I giving this effort? And the way you want to justify it is you're giving this effort because you're part of this community, and it's important to you and the community. I mean, as soon as you start giving up those identifiers, those badges that exact some kind of a cost, your community is eroding away. Yeah.
I was just thinking about, I don't know your name, but your comment about diversity and isn't that a good thing, and what you're pointing out about community cohesion. And I was thinking about, of course, I wasn't alive during the 60s and not until 1979, but I wasn't really aware then anyway. So I didn't see it firsthand, but I've heard certain slogans that have been handed down and things I've heard from my parents' generation. And there was a real effort among some groups to have this globally inclusive community, casting aside the kind of the hollow rituals of old and just living as human with one another. And that didn't work out too well. It didn't. That's a beautiful idea, to live as human with one another, but the manner in which they attempted to approach it didn't last beyond 1981, if you're looking at just cultural shifts. But there was if you think of a kind of cosmopolitan, like I am a citizen of the world, approach to things, it seems that perhaps the Stoics had it right, in that their goal was, the goal of many Stoic teachers was to transcend the ritualized, the role-based, and the activity-based notion of who you are. The Roman notion of a person is that the person is defined by the role they play in the community, and then there are certain people who are unpersons because they have no role in the community. It's the Stoics, and then rapidly it's Christianity, but slightly before Christianity, it's the Stoics who have a notion of the person as a kind of thing in himself or herself, irrespective of the role played in a particular community. And yet, the Stoic tradition has a highly disciplined and highly ritualized approach to an interior formation by which the person becomes a flourishing person to enable them to be a citizen of the world. So it seems that whether you have communities that build themselves through rituals, or whether you have a notion of being able to transcend a community and meet someone outside of your tribe or even be without a tribe, in both circumstances, it requires a very rich definition of what it means to be a person and what it means to be what you are. And if you're going to cast aside all the exterior rituals, it doesn't seem that in ancient societies, at least, it was enough to rely on commerce and law to keep everybody in line. You have to become a Stoic sage. You have to become a fully, deeply virtuous person to survive without ritual. And it seems that Christianity presents both ritual and virtue.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, one more question, and then we're going to take a 15-minute break, so we'll start about 5 minutes late. So you got 3 minutes, Chris.
All right, you talked about how rituals strengthen the individual, and then you talked about how sometimes there's communal rituals and individual rituals.
Yeah.
Is there any studies that talk about the strengthening effects and the difference if it's a communal ritual over an individualistic ritual? Like, because sometimes you hear people say, it doesn't matter what rituals you have, just have a ritual. And I'm like, if it's tied to a community or not, does it really matter?
Oh, yeah, I think it does matter. Because, especially with the synchronized movements, a lot of studies have looked at communal rituals that involve synchronized movements of some kind. And that seems to lead to real physical changes in the individual. And I don't know that you can replicate those changes in an individual setting, because you can't synchronize with someone else in an individual setting. And so we see a release of endorphins. We see breathing patterns that become entrained and unified when individuals are doing synchronized rituals together. And we think that the real strong emotional bonding is coming out of these chemical and autonomic nervous system changes that are happening mutually within individuals that are sharing a ritual activity together. And so that kind of thing, I think, is going to be hard to replicate in an individual setting because, like I said, again, that requires you recognizing that you are in unison with others. Whereas the individual ritual may be very successful at relaxing the individual, and there are chemical changes that go on as relaxation takes place and that sort of thing, but you don't have that strong emotional bonding with others. And the connection with others and the willingness to sacrifice for others that happens in communal, especially communal ritual that involves synchrony.
Okay, let's thank Matt one more time.
Thank you.